The house looked exactly the way it always did during family gatherings. Too clean, too organized, as if order itself were a performance. The kind of suburban home where framed photos lined the hallway, each one silently reinforcing a story of unity and shared history. Laughter drifted from the living room, overlapping conversations blending into a familiar hum that suggested warmth, belonging, and tradition. On the surface, everything was normal. That was the first warning sign. Claire Morgan arrived carrying a store-bought dessert, greeted with quick hugs and casual comments about traffic and weather. Nothing about the moment hinted at conflict. This was not a family that shouted or argued openly. Power here was quieter, exercised through implication rather than command. It lived in expectations, in who paid for what, in who was allowed to speak uninterrupted at the table. Rachel Morgan moved easily through the room, confident and practiced, occupying space without asking permission. She had always been good at that, assertive in a way the family interpreted as leadership. Where others hesitated, Rachel decided. Where others adapted, she directed. Over the years, that confidence had slowly shifted into authority, rarely questioned and often rewarded. Dinner was served buffet style, people filling their plates and choosing seats out of habit rather than intention. Claire noticed, as always, that seating arrangements followed an unspoken hierarchy. Certain chairs were claimed without discussion. Others remained flexible, temporary. No one acknowledged it aloud, but everyone respected it. These small rituals had shaped the family dynamic for years. Conversation stayed light at first. Updates about work, comments on rising costs, jokes repeated from previous gatherings. Rachel dominated the rhythm, steering topics effortlessly, drawing attention without appearing to demand it. When she spoke, people listened. When she paused, others filled the silence carefully, as if unsure whether they were allowed to continue. Claire had learned long ago that harmony in this family came from cooperation, not resistance. Being agreeable had always seemed easier than pushing back. Over time, that habit had hardened into role, reliable, accommodating, indebted. Not because of anything explicitly said, but because of how often the narrative returned to favors, sacrifices, and shared history. As plates emptied and conversations deepened, the atmosphere subtly shifted, not enough to alarm anyone unfamiliar with the family, but enough to register as tension to someone who knew the pattern. Rachel's tone sharpened slightly. Her comments became more pointed, framed as observations rather than accusations. She referenced past support, collective effort, moments when everyone pitched in. Claire felt it then, that familiar tightening, the sense that the evening was moving toward something unspoken, but inevitable. In this family, confrontation never arrived abruptly. It was eased into the room, introduced as practicality or concern, disguised as fairness. By the time it became explicit, resistance already felt unreasonable. Rachel positioned herself closer, leaning casually against the counter. Her posture was relaxed, almost friendly, but her attention was focused. Others continued their conversations, unaware or uninterested. Linda Morgan laughed softly at something Thomas had said, both of them avoiding the shift happening inches away. When the phrase finally came, it wasn't raised or dramatic. It was delivered evenly, almost kindly, as if stating a simple truth everyone already understood. "You owe us," not shouted, not emphasized, just stated, as though it explained everything. The room didn't go quiet. No one reacted. Life continued around the sentence, as if it were nothing more than background noise. That was the most unsettling part. The idea of debt, emotional, financial, relational, was so embedded in the family's logic that it required no defense. Claire didn't respond immediately, not because of shock, but because the statement reframed years of interactions in a single moment. Favors were no longer kindness. Support was no longer mutual. Everything had been recorded somewhere, tallied carefully, waiting to be collected. Rachel waited, confident. She had said versions of this before, softer, indirect. This time it was clearer, more final. The assumption was simple. Agreement would follow. It always had. What Rachel didn't notice was the shift taking place internally. Not anger, not fear, recognition. The sudden understanding that this dynamic depended entirely on one thing: the willingness to accept the premise of debt. Claire looked around the room, at the familiar faces, the carefully maintained order. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. This was not the beginning of a confrontation. It was the beginning of something far quieter, a choice that wouldn't announce itself, a decision that would unfold over time, invisible at first, misunderstood until it was irreversible. The gathering continued. Dessert was served. Smiles returned. But beneath the surface, the balance had already begun to move. The neighborhood itself reflected the Morgan family's values: orderly lawns, identical mailboxes, an unspoken agreement about how things should look from the outside. This was a place where appearances mattered, where success was measured in stability and quiet compliance rather than risk or reinvention. The Morgans fit neatly into that environment, reinforcing it and being reinforced by it in return. Claire had grown up learning how to read these signals early: which opinions were welcome, which emotions were acceptable, which ambitions were praised, and which were gently redirected. Independence had never been discouraged outright. It was simply framed as impractical, unnecessary, or selfish when it conflicted with the family's preferred narrative. Rachel thrived within that structure. She understood its rules instinctively and knew how to leverage them. She remembered birthdays, organized gatherings, managed logistics. These actions were often presented as generosity, but they also created influence. Being indispensable made authority feel earned rather than imposed. Linda Morgan avoided direct conflict whenever possible. Her role was smoothing edges, redirecting tension, pretending not to notice imbalance. Thomas Morgan followed, whichever voice sounded most confident, mistaking certainty for correctness. Together, they maintained stability, not by fairness but by habit. Claire, by contrast, had always occupied a quieter position, reliable, helpful, rarely demanding. Over time, this consistency had been reinterpreted as obligation. Support given freely was remembered selectively, often minimized or reframed as expected behavior. Gratitude flowed upward, never sideways. Outside the family, Claire's life told a different story. At work, decisiveness was expected. Among friends, boundaries were natural and reciprocal. But inside the Morgan household, those boundaries dissolved. Old roles resurfaced the moment she crossed the threshold, as if time itself bent backward. Rachel's authority extended beyond logistics. She shaped narratives. When stories about the past were told, her version became the accepted one. Small adjustments accumulated over years, altering how events were remembered. It wasn't outright deception. It was confidence applied consistently until alternatives faded. Cultural expectations reinforced the dynamic. Loyalty was prized above autonomy. Questioning motives was equated with ingratitude. Harmony mattered more than honesty. These values weren't enforced through punishment, but through approval: who received it, who lost it, and who worked hardest to regain it. Claire began to notice how often conversations revolved around contribution. Who helped whom? Who sacrificed more? These discussions were never framed as accusations, but they always moved in the same direction: toward debt, toward responsibility that felt permanent and vaguely defined. What made the system effective was its subtlety. There were no rules written down, no explicit demands. Everything operated through implication. If you belonged, you understood. If you questioned, you disrupted. Rachel understood this better than anyone. She didn't need to insist. She only needed to remind. A raised eyebrow, a reference to the past, a calm statement left to settle. The family structure did the rest. Yet cracks had been forming long before the gathering. Claire had started noticing patterns: how often requests flowed in one direction, how rarely they were reciprocated, how decisions were made without consultation, justified afterward as necessary. These observations hadn't led to action yet. Awareness was new and fragile, but once seen, it lingered. Each interaction added clarity. Each reminder of owing sharpened the contrast between genuine connection and managed obligation. By the time the gathering unfolded, the groundwork was already there. Rachel's confidence rested on years of unchallenged authority. The family's compliance rested on habit, and Claire's silence rested on patience that was quietly running out. Nothing in the environment suggested imminent change. That was the illusion. Stability often masks the moment just before transformation. The system appeared solid, but it depended on one fragile assumption, that Claire would continue to accept the role assigned to her. And that assumption was about to be tested. The days following the gathering passed, without immediate fallout. That in itself was unsettling. Claire noticed how quickly the family returned to routine. As if nothing significant had occurred, messages resumed their usual tone. Group chats filled with logistics and polite updates. Rachel's confidence remained intact, reinforced by the assumption that her statement had landed exactly where it was meant to. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Claire felt it most clearly in her own reactions, where guilt once rose automatically. There was now hesitation, a pause. She began rereading past interactions with fresh clarity, recognizing how often requests had been framed as necessities rather than choices. Rachel reached out first, casually, with a favor that mirrored dozens of others before it. The wording was familiar, efficient, friendly, carrying the quiet expectation of compliance. Claire agreed without resistance, not because she felt obligated, but because she was paying attention. The task itself was minor. What mattered was what followed. Rachel referenced it later, folding it into a broader narrative of contribution. Claire listened carefully, noting how quickly help transformed into leverage. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was observable, repeatable, precise. At the next family interaction, Claire made a small adjustment. When Rachel alluded to shared responsibility, Claire responded calmly, reinforcing the same logic, but extending it. If contribution defined authority, then responsibility followed contribution. The statement wasn't confrontational. It was consistent. Rachel nodded, momentarily satisfied, unaware of the boundary taking shape. Linda noticed the change first. Not consciously, but instinctively. She stepped in more often, redirecting conversations, smoothing over moments that felt unfamiliar. Thomas remained silent, defaulting to neutrality, his approval following whichever voice sounded most assured in the moment. The real tension emerged gradually. Rachel began referencing favors more frequently, her tone sharpening as the expected responses failed to materialize. Claire didn't argue, she didn't withdraw. She simply responded with the same logic Rachel had introduced: calm, reasonable, difficult to dispute without contradiction. This unsettled the balance. Rachel was accustomed to emotional reactions, defensiveness, reassurance, apology. Instead, she encountered consistency. Each interaction reinforced the same premise. If debt existed, then it applied evenly. If sacrifice granted authority, then it carried responsibility. Claire's behavior remained outwardly unchanged. She showed up, she participated, she remained cooperative, but she no longer filled silence with justification. She no longer rushed to smooth discomfort that wasn't hers to manage. That restraint created space, and in that space, the family dynamic began revealing its strain. Rachel attempted to reassert control indirectly. She shared stories that highlighted her past efforts, positioning herself as indispensable. These narratives had always worked before. This time, they were met with acknowledgement, but not submission. Claire accepted the stories without absorbing the obligation attached to them. Other relatives began noticing the difference. Conversations lingered awkwardly where they once flowed predictably. Expectations were met with questions rather than assumptions, not confrontational questions, clarifying ones, the kind that required definition. Pressure built quietly. Rachel's confidence wavered, not visibly, but in rhythm. She spoke faster. She filled silences more aggressively. Control, once effortless, now required maintenance. Claire remained steady. She didn't escalate. She didn't seek allies. She allowed the system to respond to its own logic. Each interaction tested the same assumption: that obligation could be asserted without consent. The family environment grew tense in subtle ways. Schedules became contested. Responsibilities were discussed rather than assigned. What had once been understood implicitly now required explanation. And explanation, Claire realized, was where authority weakened. Rachel confronted her privately, framing the conversation as concern. She spoke of strain, of fairness, of how things had always worked. Claire listened, nodding, absorbing the words without pushing back. When she responded, she did so carefully, aligning her reasoning with Rachel's own principles. That alignment was disarming. It left no room for accusation without contradiction. Rachel ended the conversation unsettled, uncertain where control had slipped, but aware that something was no longer reliable. For Claire, the conflict had crystallized. This was no longer about a single comment at a family gathering. It was about the structure beneath it, a system that depended on unspoken agreement, a balance maintained through habit rather than consent. The more Claire maintained consistency, the more pressure shifted outward. Expectations exposed themselves. Authority demanded justification. And justification, once required, lost its quiet power. The conflict was no longer visible as confrontation. It existed as tension, as friction, as an unspoken recalibration. The family continued functioning, but no longer smoothly. Claire understood then that the next phase would force the issue. The system could not adjust indefinitely. It would either adapt or reveal itself completely. And when it did, the consequences would be impossible to ignore. As weeks passed, the strain didn't announce itself through arguments, but through logistics. Small things that had once been automatic now required discussion. Schedules overlapped. Assumptions stalled. What had always just worked suddenly needed confirmation. The family still gathered, still shared meals, still exchanged updates, but the rhythm was off. One of the first subplots emerged around responsibility. Rachel had long positioned herself as the organizer, the one who handled details others avoided. Now, that role began to feel heavier. When she delegated tasks, she found that people asked follow-up questions, not objections, clarifications. It slowed everything down, and that loss of efficiency irritated her more than open resistance ever had. Linda attempted to compensate. She called Claire more often, checking in under the guise of concern. The conversations were gentle, indirect, filled with pauses that suggested more than they said. Linda spoke about family harmony, about how stress affected everyone. She never mentioned Rachel directly, but the implication was clear. Things felt unstable, and Claire was expected to help steady them. Claire listened without committing. She responded warmly, but avoided reassurance that implied responsibility. This was new. In the past, she would have rushed to restore comfort. Now, she let discomfort exist. It wasn't hostility, it was restraint. Meanwhile, Thomas withdrew further into passivity. When asked for input, he deferred. When tension surfaced, he changed the subject. His silence wasn't neutral. It reinforced whichever position required the least effort. That default had always benefited Rachel. Now, as her certainty wavered, his absence of support became noticeable. Another layer of complexity formed outside the family. Claire's work began demanding more of her time, forcing her to make choices that conflicted with family expectations. In the past, she would have rearranged everything. This time, she didn't. She informed rather than asked. The shift was subtle, but its impact was immediate. Rachel reacted by increasing pressure elsewhere. She referenced timelines, upcoming events, obligations tied to shared history. The narrative expanded, pulling in more examples, more reminders. It felt like acceleration, a push to reassert control before it slipped completely. At the same time, extended relatives began sensing the change. They weren't aware of its source, but they felt its effects. Conversations grew cautious. Invitations were phrased more carefully. The family system, once seamless, now required negotiation. The most significant subplot unfolded quietly between Claire and herself. She began documenting interactions, not to build a case, but to track patterns, dates, requests, language used. The exercise revealed something important. The system relied heavily on ambiguity. Once actions were named clearly, their emotional weight diminished. Pressure intensified as a major family event approached, one that required coordination, money, and shared decision-making. Rachel assumed leadership without discussion, as she always had, but this time, when she outlined plans, responses didn't come immediately. Questions followed, alternatives surfaced. Consensus fractured. Rachel framed the resistance as impractical. She spoke of efficiency, of how things had always been done, but repetition weakened her position. Each insistence highlighted the lack of agreement beneath it. Claire watched the tension build without intervening. She understood now that stepping in too early would restore the old balance. The system needed to reach its own breaking point. Only then would its assumptions become visible to everyone involved. The pressure of the upcoming event created a countdown. Decisions couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Roles had to be defined, responsibilities assigned, and once defined, they could be examined. Rachel's frustration surfaced in sharper tones and shorter patience. She wasn't losing control dramatically, but she was losing it steadily. The effort required to maintain authority increased with each interaction. For Claire, the complexity clarified one truth. This was no longer a personal conflict. It was structural. The family dynamic itself was being tested by circumstances that demanded clarity instead of habit. The stage was set, subplots converged, time pressed forward. And when the system was forced to choose between adaptation and exposure, it would not be able to hide behind implication any longer. The turning point didn't come with a confrontation. It arrived through paperwork. The upcoming family event, long treated as a shared tradition, required formal decisions this time. Venues needed deposits. Names had to be attached to responsibilities. Costs could no longer be vaguely handled later. What had once survived on assumption now demanded structure. Rachel took charge immediately. She circulated a plan, confident and efficient, outlining roles as if they were already agreed upon. Claire read it carefully. Nothing in the document was overtly unfair. That was the point. Authority here was exercised through presentation, not force. But one detail stood out. Rachel had listed Claire as financially responsible for a significant portion of the expenses, justified with a familiar explanation about everything the family had done over the years. It wasn't framed as a demand. It was framed as balance. Claire didn't respond right away. She waited. When she did reply, it wasn't to object. It was to ask for clarification, in writing. Calm, specific questions. What exactly was being covered? How were contributions calculated? Who had approved the structure? The message was polite, neutral, impossible to dismiss as emotional. The response took longer than usual. Rachel replied with confidence, but her explanation revealed something unexpected. The plan relied entirely on precedent, not agreement. On how things had always worked. There was no prior consent, no shared decision-making, just assumption formalized. That was the moment the dynamic changed. Claire forwarded the exchange to the family group chat, not as accusation, but as transparency. She framed it as a request for confirmation, inviting others to weigh in before commitments were finalized. The language was careful, inclusive. It offered everyone a chance to participate. Silence followed. Not the comfortable silence the family was used to, but the kind that signals disruption. One by one, responses trickled in. Questions, mild hesitations, alternative suggestions, nothing confrontational. But the unanimity Rachel depended on didn't materialize. Rachel reacted quickly. She reframed the discussion as urgency, deadlines, consequences, the need to act decisively. Her messages became more frequent, more directive. Control was no longer assumed, it was asserted. And that assertion revealed the fault line. Claire replied again, this time with a single sentence that shifted everything. She agreed to the responsibility on one condition, that the same logic applied consistently, that authority and obligation be linked openly, with clear consent from everyone involved. It wasn't refusal, it was acceptance with structure. Rachel objected immediately, but her objection exposed the truth she hadn't intended to reveal. She didn't want shared authority. She wanted unquestioned compliance. The language of fairness cracked under scrutiny. Others noticed. Linda attempted to intervene, urging calm, suggesting the family not make this bigger than it needed to be. But the moment had already passed. Once assumptions were challenged publicly, they couldn't be quietly restored. Thomas asked a question, his first real one in years. It was simple. Who had agreed to what? Rachel answered defensively. Her tone sharpened. The confidence that once felt natural now sounded strained. Each explanation led to another question. Each question required justification. The turning point crystallized not in what was said, but in who hesitated. Rachel hesitated. For the first time, she didn't have immediate answers that closed the conversation. The structure she'd relied on, habit, silence, implied debt, was no longer sufficient. It had been brought into the open, where it couldn't survive unchanged. Claire watched the exchange unfold without intervening further. She didn't push, she didn't correct. She let the system respond to its own exposure. By the end of the conversation, nothing had been resolved, but everything had changed. Decisions were postponed. Responsibilities remained undefined. Rachel's authority, once seamless, was now conditional, dependent on explanation, on consent. That night, Claire reviewed the messages again. Not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The power shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. The system no longer operated invisibly. Rachel reached out privately, her message shorter than usual, less polished. She framed the situation as misunderstanding, suggesting they talk and clear the air. The invitation carried an urgency that hadn't been there before. Claire didn't respond immediately. She understood now that the point of no return had been crossed. The family dynamic could no longer rely on implication. Whatever came next would require acknowledgement or escalation. And escalation would force everyone to choose a side. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, but the foundation had cracked. And once a structure is forced into the light, it can never return to the shadows it depended on to exist. The shift became visible in the days that followed, not through confrontation, but through hesitation. Decisions that once moved quickly stalled. Messages were reread before being sent. Simple questions now carried weight. The family system, accustomed to operating on assumption, was learning what friction felt like. Rachel reacted first through activity. She doubled down on efficiency, sending follow-ups, proposing revised plans, reframing responsibilities. Her tone remained professional, but the ease was gone. Each message felt calibrated, as if authority now required constant reinforcement rather than quiet acceptance. Claire responded consistently, without urgency. She acknowledged messages, confirmed details, asked clarifying questions. Nothing about her behavior suggested rebellion, and yet her refusal to absorb pressure altered the rhythm of every exchange. The imbalance had shifted just enough to be felt. Linda's response took a different form. She called more often, her voice careful, circling the issue without naming it. She spoke about stress, about how these things can get out of hand, about the importance of not letting misunderstandings grow. The implication was familiar. Resolution meant return. Claire listened, but didn't offer reassurances this time. Thomas remained largely silent, but his silence carried new weight. When asked to confirm plans, he deferred. When pressed for agreement, he hesitated. That hesitation, small, uncharacteristic, introduced uncertainty into a role that had always functioned as passive endorsement. Extended family members adjusted quickly. They became more cautious, more deliberate. Requests were phrased as questions. Offers came with options attached. What had once been automatic now required consensus. No one named the change, but everyone adapted to it. Rachel attempted a private reset. She suggested meeting for coffee, framing it as a chance to get back on the same page. The phrasing implied misalignment rather than conflict. Claire agreed, setting a time that worked for her schedule, not rearranging it to accommodate urgency. The meeting was controlled but strained. Rachel spoke first, outlining concerns about efficiency, about the family's image, about how uncertainty created unnecessary complications. She avoided the word control, but the structure of her argument depended on it. Claire listened without interruption. When she responded, she didn't challenge Rachel's intentions. She acknowledged the effort, the history, the desire for smooth outcomes. Then she restated her position calmly. Clarity wasn't conflict. Agreement required consent. Responsibility required definition. Rachel pushed back, gently at first, then with frustration. She referenced the past again, how much she had carried, how often she had stepped in when others didn't. The narrative was familiar. What was new was its effect. It didn't land. Without emotional reinforcement, the argument lost momentum. Rachel found herself repeating points that no longer produced the expected response. The conversation ended without resolution. Both women aware that the dynamic had changed, but unwilling to name it outright. Afterward, Rachel's behavior shifted again. She became more guarded, less expansive. Where she once assumed alignment, she now sought confirmation. Where she once assigned roles, she now proposed them. Authority had become conditional. The consequences extended beyond logistics. Family gatherings grew quieter, more segmented. Conversations stayed safe, avoiding topics that might require agreement. The sense of effortless unity was gone, replaced by cautious coexistence. Claire noticed something else as well. Her own position felt lighter, not because things were easier, but because they were clearer. She was no longer managing emotions that weren't hers. She was no longer smoothing over discomfort created by imbalance. The family system hadn't collapsed. It had adapted, but imperfectly. The cracks were visible now, and they influenced every interaction. The question was no longer whether change had occurred, but whether it would be acknowledged or resisted. Rachel seemed to understand this too. Her frustration wasn't explosive. It was contained, strategic. She hadn't lost control completely, but she no longer held it unquestioned. The consequences were cumulative. Each clarified boundary, each delayed response, each request for agreement reinforced the same message. The old structure no longer functioned as intended. What came next would determine whether the family recalibrated honestly, or whether pressure would be applied to force a return to familiar ground. And pressure, Claire knew, was the system's final test. The pressure didn't disappear. It changed shape. Rachel stopped pushing openly and began testing limits instead. Small requests, casual assumptions slipped into conversations, comments framed as jokes. Each one was an attempt to see whether the old reflexes would return. Each one was met with the same response: calm acknowledgement followed by clarification. Claire didn't announce boundaries. She practiced them. When asked to take on a task, she asked for timelines. When expenses were implied, she asked for written confirmation. When decisions were framed as already made, she requested context. None of it was confrontational. All of it required intention. The effort to maintain control began outweighing its benefits. This consistency started producing visible effects. Rachel adjusted her approach, choosing words more carefully, pausing before making assumptions. The ease she once had in directing outcomes gave way to negotiation. It slowed her down, and that slowdown exposed how much authority had depended on speed and certainty rather than agreement. Linda adapted in her own way. She stopped calling as frequently, but when she did, her tone was different, less corrective, more observational. She spoke about how things felt different lately, without assigning blame. Claire responded honestly but briefly, refusing to take responsibility for restoring balance she hadn't disrupted. Thomas surprised everyone by stepping in once. During a discussion about scheduling, he asked for clarification instead of deferring. It wasn't dramatic, but it changed the direction of the conversation. For the first time, Rachel wasn't the only voice shaping the outcome. The system noticed. Outside the family, Claire's life continued expanding. Work responsibilities increased. New opportunities emerged. She accepted them without apology. When conflicts with family plans arose, she communicated decisions rather than asking permission. Each instance reinforced the same principle. Her time and priorities were not communal property. This didn't create distance. It created definition. Family gatherings resumed, but their texture changed. Conversations were shorter. Topics stayed neutral. The emotional charge that once hummed beneath every interaction had diminished. It wasn't peace. It was recalibration. Rachel struggled most with this phase. Growth doesn't reward those who thrived in imbalance. She oscillated between restraint and irritation, unsure which version of herself would regain footing. Her frustration surfaced in moments of silence rather than argument, long pauses where certainty used to live. Claire noticed but didn't fill them. That restraint became her greatest signal of growth. She no longer rushed to smooth, explain, or justify. She allowed others to experience the discomfort of undefined roles. In doing so, she removed herself from the mechanism that had sustained it. The most significant change wasn't in what Claire said, but in what she no longer did. She stopped volunteering information preemptively. She stopped anticipating needs that weren't voiced. She stopped absorbing emotional weight by default. Over time, this shift altered how others approached her. Requests became clearer. Expectations became explicit. And when clarity wasn't offered, she asked for it, The result wasn't conflict, it was alignment. Rachel attempted one final recalibration. She proposed a return to how things used to work, framed as efficiency, nostalgia, unity. The offer was subtle, almost appealing. Claire listened, thanked her for the thought, and declined, without explanation. The refusal wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was final. That moment marked a quiet threshold. Not a victory, but a completion. The growth phase wasn't about proving strength. It was about sustaining it without effort. The family didn't fracture. It adjusted around the absence of automatic compliance. Some relationships softened, others became distant, but all became more honest. Claire's role was no longer defined by obligation. It was defined by choice. And that choice, consistently applied, had reshaped the system more effectively than any confrontation ever could. The next phase wouldn't be about resistance or adaptation. It would be about resolution. Because when growth stabilizes, the only question left is how the story ends. The family system no longer resisted openly. It consolidated. What had once been diffuse tension now concentrated around a single question that no one said out loud. Who decides now? The routines continued, but they felt provisional, as if everyone were waiting for a signal that hadn't arrived yet. Conversations stayed polite, but underneath them ran a current of anticipation. The upcoming family event, postponed but not forgotten, returned to the center of attention. Deadlines were unavoidable. Deposits needed confirmation. Someone had to finalize decisions. The delay had created pressure, and pressure demanded resolution. Rachel resumed coordination, but cautiously. Her messages were measured, phrased as proposals rather than instructions. She asked for availability. She requested input. On the surface, it looked collaborative, but the structure underneath remained familiar. She was still positioning herself as the final authority. Claire noticed immediately. This time, she didn't wait for ambiguity to build. When Rachel circulated the revised promptly, acknowledging the work and confirming her participation. Within clearly defined limits, she specified what she would handle, what she wouldn't, and what required collective agreement. The message was neutral, transparent, unavoidable. The response from the group was telling. Others followed her lead. They clarified roles. They asked questions. They mirrored the language of definition. The effect was subtle but decisive. Authority dispersed. Rachel reacted with restraint that bordered on rigidity. She complied publicly, but privately her frustration surfaced. Her messages grew shorter. Her tone flattened. Control, once effortless, now required negotiation at every step. Linda attempted one final intervention. She invited both sisters to lunch, framing it as a chance to reset before things became stressful. The implication was clear. Resolution meant restoring harmony. Claire accepted the invitation, but without expectation. The lunch was polite, almost scripted. Linda spoke about family, about memories, about how important it was to move forward together. Rachel listened, nodding occasionally, offering agreement without warmth. The conversation avoided specifics, circling the real issue without touching it. Claire didn't interrupt. She waited. When Linda finally asked what she thought, Claire answered simply. She said she wanted things to be clear, shared decisions, defined responsibilities, no assumptions, no debts carried forward. The words were calm, but they landed heavily. Rachel pushed back carefully. She spoke about trust, about how clarity could feel like distance, about how families worked best when people didn't keep score. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Claire didn't argue the point. She acknowledged the concern and repeated her position. Unchanged, clarity wasn't distance. It was respect, and respect didn't require anyone to owe anything. The conversation ended without consensus. That unresolved tension became the final catalyst. The event loomed closer. Decisions couldn't be postponed again. The family had reached a threshold where neutrality was no longer sustainable. Rachel made her move shortly after. She sent a message to the group, outlining final decisions, framing them as necessary due to time constraints. It was decisive, confident, almost reminiscent of the old dynamic. But something crucial was missing. Agreement. Claire replied publicly, not to challenge the plan, but to acknowledge it, and to state clearly that she wouldn't proceed without shared confirmation. She attached her earlier message. referencing the need for consent. Others followed suit, some hesitantly, some decisively. The group chat filled with pauses, confirmations, and clarifications. The plan stalled again, but this time visibly. Rachel's authority hit its limit. The preparation phase culminated not in action, but in suspension. Everything was ready except permission, and permission could no longer be assumed. The system had narrowed to a single point of tension. One final decision would expose everything. Either authority would be redistributed openly, or someone would attempt to reclaim it forcefully. Claire felt no urgency to resolve it. The work was already done. The conditions were set. Whatever came next would reveal the truth of the family dynamic, beyond any doubt. The climax wasn't about to arrive through confrontation. It would arrive through choice. And that choice, once made, would end the story one way or another. The deadline arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic countdown, no warning announcement, just an email from the venue requesting confirmation by end of day. No extensions, no flexibility. The family could no longer remain suspended in polite uncertainty. Someone had to decide, or everything would collapse. Rachel acted first. She sent a final message to the group chat, concise and authoritative, confirming the arrangements as if consensus had already been reached. Deposits, responsibilities, timelines, everything presented as settled. The tone left little room for objection. It was the old move, executed cleanly, counting on momentum to override resistance. For a brief moment, it almost worked. No one responded immediately. The familiar pause settled in, heavy with expectation. This was the space where compliance used to form, where silence met agreement, where Rachel's certainty filled the gap. Claire saw it clearly. Instead of reacting emotionally or privately, she replied in the same space where authority had been asserted. Her message was short, factual, and impossible to misinterpret. She stated that she had not agreed to the outlined responsibilities. That shared consent had been requested, but not received, and that she would not proceed under assumed obligation. No accusation, no justification, just a boundary, public calm, final. The effect was immediate. One by one, others responded. Some expressed relief, others echoed the same concern, admitting they had felt pressured, but hadn't known how to articulate it. A few asked questions they had never asked before, about costs, roles, and expectations. The illusion of unity fractured openly. Rachel reacted fast. She reframed the situation as urgency, accusing the group, indirectly, of jeopardizing the event. She emphasized consequences, inconvenience, wasted effort. The language escalated. Sharper than before, control, stripped of subtlety, showed its edge. And that was the revelation. The family saw it, not as cruelty, but as insistence without consent, authority without agreement. The very thing that had gone unnamed for years now stood fully exposed, undeniable because it was happening in real time. Lindo attempted to intervene, suggesting compromise, urging everyone to calm down and do what's best for the family. But the phrase no longer held weight. It assumed a definition no one had agreed on. Thomas spoke up next. His message was brief, uncharacteristic, and direct. He asked why decisions were being made without confirmation and why disagreement was being treated as disloyalty. It wasn't an accusation, it was a question, and it landed harder than any argument. Rachel hesitated. That hesitation, the pause where certainty used to live, was the true climax. She responded defensively, then stopped. Messages were typed, deleted, rewritten. The authority she had relied on could not survive scrutiny, not because Claire attacked it, but because it could not explain itself without revealing its own imbalance. The venue's deadline passed. The event was canceled, not dramatically, not explosively, just concluded. The email arrived confirming the cancellation, neutral and impersonal, a shared consequence, evenly distributed. No one blamed anyone outright, but no one missed what had happened. The silence afterward was different from all the others before it. It wasn't tense. It wasn't expectant. It was resolved. Rachel withdrew, not completely, but noticeably. Her messages became infrequent, cautious. The role she had occupied no longer existed in the same form. Authority hadn't transferred. It had dissolved. Claire felt the shift internally before anything else. Not triumph, not relief, grounding. The weight she had carried for years, unnamed and unmanaged, was simply gone. There was no space it needed to move into. It didn't need replacing. The family adjusted quietly. New dynamics formed slowly. Some connections weakened, others strengthened unexpectedly, but none returned to what they had been. Claire's transformation was visible, not in speeches or declarations, but in how she moved forward. She made plans without checking for approval. She participated without overextending. She declined without apology. The power had not changed hands. It had stopped being centralized. And that, more than any confrontation, was what ended the old system for good. The aftermath didn't unfold all at once. It settled. In the weeks following the canceled event, the family found a new, quieter rhythm. There were fewer messages, fewer assumptions, fewer rushed decisions. What remained was simpler, more deliberate. The absence of constant coordination created space, uncomfortable at first, but honest. Rachel didn't reclaim her role. She didn't confront it either. Her presence became measured, selective. When she spoke, she chose her words carefully. Authority, once automatic, now required invitation. Sometimes it came, often it didn't, and that uncertainty reshaped her position more effectively than resistance ever could. Linda adjusted slowly. She stopped trying to restore what had been lost and began adapting to what remained. Her calls were shorter, less corrective. She asked questions she hadn't asked before. Not all of them led to change, but they marked an awareness that balance could no longer be maintained through silence alone. Thomas became more visible, not dominant, not decisive, but present. He engaged when decisions were discussed. He asked for clarity. His involvement altered the dynamic subtly but permanently. Neutrality no longer functioned as endorsement. For Claire, the change was steady. There was no sense of victory, only alignment. She noticed how much energy had once gone into anticipating expectations that were never explicitly stated. Without that burden, her interactions felt lighter, more intentional. Family gatherings resumed, smaller and less frequent. They were quieter, but also more authentic. Conversations didn't flow as effortlessly, but they carried less weight. There was no need to perform harmony. It either existed or it didn't. Some relationships softened, others grew distant. Claire accepted both outcomes without urgency to repair or explain. The need to manage emotional outcomes that weren't hers had dissolved. The family never named what had happened. There was no formal acknowledgement, no apology, no resolution meeting. And yet, the old structure didn't return. It couldn't. Once assumptions were exposed, they lost their power to organize behavior invisibly. Claire moved forward without redefining herself for the family. She didn't replace one role with another. She simply stopped occupying the one that had been assigned without consent. The most significant consequence wasn't the loss of an event or the redistribution of authority. It was the end of inherited obligation. The idea that love required repayment, that belonging demanded debt. What remained was choice. And choice, unlike obligation, could be renewed or withdrawn freely. Claire understood now that power didn't need to be taken from anyone. It only needed to be returned to where it belonged. With herself, months later, Claire attended a smaller family dinner, one that hadn't required planning or permission. There were no seating hierarchies, no unspoken roles to fill. Conversation drifted naturally, sometimes awkward, sometimes Rachel warm. Arrived late, stayed briefly, and left without directing the room. No one commented. As Claire drove home that night, she realized something quietly profound. The family hadn't changed because she fought them. It had changed because she stopped holding it together for them. And in letting go, she hadn't lost her place. She had finally chosen. If Claire's story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own dynamics. Where have expectations been placed on you without your consent? How often has silence been mistaken for agreement? Stories like this aren't about blame. They're about clarity, about recognizing when loyalty turns into obligation and choosing, quietly, to step out of that cycle. If this narrative spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else name what they've been feeling, but couldn't articulate yet. Subscribe to the channel for more emotionally powerful stories about family, boundaries, and silent strength. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story where quiet choices change everything.